Hello and welcome. Today I'm gonna take this raw file and I'm gonna turn it into a picture like this while explaining you everything I do, every slider I use and why I use it. So quickly to the settings, I shot this with a Canon 600D with the Canon 18-55 kit lens, and here are the settings: ISO 100, 80mm, f16. I've chosen f16 just because I have some very close-up flowers here in the foreground and 1/4 of a second shutter speed. Now this is a very high contrast scene, so you have a lot of foreground that is very dark, and you also have a very bright background, the sky, and especially the sun. Now if you have such a contrasty scene, you usually want to make sure that you shoot in HDR and merge these pictures together in post. However, I actually didn't notice it at the time that there was such a difference, so I just noticed that it was actually so dark and so bright in the background when I got back to the computer and saw it there. However, I'm using this picture and I'm editing on this picture right here because I want to show you what you can do with a raw file, and that you even can salvage such a raw file from a very inexpensive camera and still end up with a great looking and high quality picture. So first thing I'm always doing is raise the shadows, and you can see already a totally different image. Don't be afraid to raise them 100, and I'm also going to bring down the highlights down 100. That just gives me a lot of detail in both highlights and shadows to play with and to edit further. But before I do any other adjustments, let me go straight to the crop module and just straighten the horizons here, because as you can see it's crooked, and if it's straight like that it just looks way better. Then I want to bring up the whites. That's just kind of my regular workflow. You can hold down the Alt key, and wherever you see something that is not black, that means that the highlights are clipped. Now usually I really want to make sure that no highlights are clipped. However, because I have the actual sun here in the frame and it is very bright, I could make it so where the sun isn't even overexposed, so we have all of the detail in there. However, I would sacrifice a lot of overall dynamic, so I'm just gonna bring it to the right here and make sure that nothing else but the very sun is overexposed, and that definitely looks better than before. Just adds a ton of dynamic. Now once again, if you have a normal picture, if you don't have, for example, a lamp or a lantern or a fire or the actual sun in the frame, you want to make sure that you don't overexpose anything and that none of the highlights are clipped. Then I'm gonna go down to the blacks and bring down the blacks there. You can press down the Alt key as well, and here it's really totally different to the whites, because I really don't mind if the blacks are clipped in my picture. If some of the blacks are clipped, that really can actually help to get a little bit of dynamic, and it's not nearly as distracting as clipped whites. So just don't be afraid to go into the clipped blacks, just be sure to go with whatever looks best there. Then contrast really is depending on the picture, but don't be afraid to go minus contrast, because for example in this picture I really think that will work well. Here blacks is a separate form of contrast. It just kind of affects the very dark parts of the image, while the contrast slider is just kind of, you know, it affects the overall contrast and adds or decreases contrast very evenly over the entire picture. Then exposure, if you should draw, don't be afraid to go into the exposure as well. However, I really think we have a pretty cool picture here, and there's not any plus or negative exposure needed for now. So I'm just gonna leave that at 0 and go actually up to the color temperature. Now this is a very important tool, especially if you shoot sunsets, and a general rule that I like to use here is I want to make the picture not look very bluish, but I also don't want to go straight into the warm orange tones and make my whole picture look very orange. I like to go in the middle of them both and just make sure that I have some blue tones, but I also have some warm tones in the picture. So that's a very nice starting point, and that gives a lot of diversity in your picture that you can work with later, and I think it looks really the best in my personal style, in my personal opinion, so I'm just gonna leave it there. And tint, now if you're shooting a sunset, I often like to bring the tint a little bit to the right, just to add a little bit of magenta and some more color into the picture. I really think that works well, but of course if you would like to keep it a little bit more natural, so to say, you can just leave tint where it was, but I'm gonna add a little bit of magenta here. Yeah, just something like that. Looks pretty good. So now we're done with that stuff up here. The last thing would be clarity and vibrance. Clarity first. Also, this is kind of the same as with the contrast. Now it has a very different effect, but don't be afraid to go minus clarity if that works best for your picture. And also there's not really a set tactic that I usually do. It's really depending on every single picture, on what adjustment and what clarity, you know, what amount of clarity you want to add or decrease. Now in sunset pictures I actually often like to bring down the clarity just to kinda, you know, emphasize this very smooth and soft look, whereas, you know, bringing it to the right just gives a very harsh look, which really can work great, for example, for very stormy black and white images, but for something like this, I actually think going a little bit into the minus works even better. Now, vibrance and saturation, usually you want to bring up the vibrance or saturation if you shoot raw, just because the raw file is meant to capture as much detail and doesn't give you as much color or contrast. You know, that's something that you can add in post and in return get greater dynamic range and greater quality of your picture. But if you bring down the blacks and you add a lot of contrast, sometimes that is not even necessary to add any vibrance or saturation, because it almost looks like you've already added that by bringing up the contrast, for example. However, because we haven't brought down the blacks here that much, and I've actually gone minus with the contrast, I think I'm gonna go a little bit of plus with the Vibrance tool here. Maybe a little bit more than just a little bit, actually. I think around plus 40 works the best here. By the way, I like Vibrance more than saturation. I usually just use Vibrance if I want to add anything, just because saturation kinda, you know, as you can see, here's the same value as we had before with Vibrance, and it just doesn't look as natural. So that's why I really like Vibrance here. And Tonal curve is the second most important tool that you have, and there is one slider in particular that is probably one of my top 3 sliders in all of Lightroom. That is the highlight slider right here. The highlights up in the basics adjustment are totally different to this one right here. In the basic adjustments, they will just affect the overall bright tones of your picture, whereas the highlight slider in the tonal curve will just affect the very bright parts of the picture. So when I bring that up, it just affects the very, very bright parts of your picture, and that way you can add so much dynamic and make your picture look so much better. So I always bring up the highlight slider, and you can go crazy with it, but for this picture right here, I think 100 is a little bit too much, so I feel like 50-55 works the best there. And you can see the difference. Here's before and here's after. Just adds so much more dynamic and makes your picture look so much more alive and interesting. So the last 3 sliders down here in the tonal curve are not nearly as important, but they're still worth to play around with. I really don't have a set tactic when it comes to these sliders down here. I really just play around with them and stick with whatever works best. I think maybe even bring down the darks a little bit, something like that. and in return bring up the shadows. Now the shadow slider is almost like the highlight slider down here. It will just affect the very dark parts of your picture. So I think that looks pretty good. A last thing that you have down here is the point curve, and here you can select another version of contrast, a very subtle and very fine version of contrast. I sometimes don't even bother with it because it doesn't have that great of an impact to your picture, not that great of a difference. But I'd definitely suggest you do still play around with it if you have the time, and especially if you're still learning. Because for example here, I feel like medium contrast works a little bit better than linear for my personal taste, so I'm just gonna stick there. Then Hsl Tool, this is a tool that will not have that big of a difference to your picture. That said, it's still worth to play around if you have the time and if you're still learning especially. So because this is a full tutorial, I really want to go in depth with everything, so I'm actually going to cover the Hsl tool here. Here you have hue, saturation and luminance, and it doesn't even matter really much what they do. The thing is, you want to play around with them, and the best way I found to do that is just grab this little pinpointer and go to one of your major colors in your picture that you can change. For example, here we have this bluish purplish color 1, we have this orangey reddish color down here 2, and we have the greenish color in the grass down here, which is number 3. Now we obviously have a lot of other very fine colors, but I really found that the Hsl tool really just works best if you just use them with the most prominent colors, which in this case is blue, orange and green. So I'm just gonna drag it over a part of the color, here first of all blue, and just go down and up with my mouse and just stick with whatever works best. Obviously this will change the hue of your blues, and you know, just stick with whatever works best. There really isn't any set tactic, but I really think that works better than the default. Here's before and here's after, so I'm just gonna stick there. By the way, the reason why I'm using this little pinpointer instead of just going to the sliders is because often some colors are made out of different colors, 2 or 3 different sliders. So by using this little pinpointer, Lightroom will automatically decide how much of, for example, purple and how much of blues is that color right here made of, and adjust it accordingly to my mouse movement. So I really like that, and I think it works best. I'm gonna go a little bit quicker with the rest here with the other colors, but just be aware it's exactly the same, just stick with whatever works best. And the greens lastly here, maybe even bring them a little bit more towards that tone, and then you just want to repeat that with the saturation and luminance, and just, you know, stick with whatever works best. I'm gonna do it quite quick here just to not bore you. Obviously if you're doing this for yourself, you might want to spend a little bit more time and really pixel peep and see what exact adjustment of the slider works the very best. But I'm just gonna do that really quick here, and I think we're pretty much done. Let me quickly show you before the Hsl tool and after, so you can see not that big of a difference, but it definitely does have a difference, and it makes the overall picture look a little bit better. Then split toning down here. Now this is totally different. This will have a huge impact to your picture. Well, at least if you're editing a sunset. Depending on your picture, it can have almost none impact, and it might not even be worth you know, adjusting. But definitely if you have a very colorful picture, and especially a sunset where there's kind of, you know, light coming out of the sky, I really love this tool. And first thing I want to do here is go to the highlights and just play around with all of the colors, and just, you know, crank up the saturation here just so you see what the color actually looks like, and just, you know, go through all of the different colors and just choose one if you want to choose one, of course, and you know, just add that to the highlights of your picture. Now I think I'm gonna go with a little bit of an orange here, and of course I'm gonna bring down the saturation because that was way too much. I'm just gonna add a little bit of saturation here, and you can see it definitely changes the picture. Now once again, you might not find any color to work, then you can of course just reset it and go to the next tool, but I really suggest you to at least play around with it. And I really love that slider because it doesn't add color as even and as spread out as the temperature slider. It really just adds more color towards the highlights and the bright parts of the image, which really can create a lot of diversity and a lot of dynamic in your picture. And you know, that way you really get even more colors and more differentiation of colors in your picture. Now shadows I tend to not use as much as highlights, because often I feel like highlights just do enough already, but of course you can still play around with them, and if you want to add any color here you definitely can do so. Just know that it's not gonna have that big of an impact as the highlights. At least I found it to be that way. So here I might just add a little bit of blues, actually more towards the purples in the shadows. Once again, I want this picture to be very warm because it's a sunset, but that way you really just get a little bit of more variation in the colors, and you, for example, have the foreground a little bit less warm than this part of the sky right here, and so on. So really up to you, really your choice what you want to do. Then down here at the detail tool, here you'll just want to make sure that you zoom in 1:1, and you can see a lot of noise right away. But the first thing you want to do here is add sharpening. Now depending on your camera, your lens, obviously I shot this with the Canon 18-55 kit lens, which isn't a very sharp lens at all, but even if you have a very sharp lens, a very expensive lens, you often can add some sharpening and it makes the picture look even better. Especially if you print your picture, I found sharpening to work, you know, wonders, even if you already have a super sharp picture. So you just want to add an amount that looks good to you. You don't want to overdo that, otherwise your picture loses all of its natural look. And I think I'm gonna go with around 40-45 here. Then you want to make sure that you zoom out again and bring the masking slider to the right. Everything that's white is going to be sharpened and everything that's black is not going to be sharpened. So it's very important that you bring the masking slider to the right until you don't select much of the sky, because if you select sharpening for the sky or other non-textured surfaces, for example walls or for example flat water, you will just introduce noise. So you want to make sure that you don't do that. You don't have to get it perfectly, otherwise you might not get enough sharpening on the actual textured surfaces on your picture. But if you just bring it to the right to where the most of the sky is not selected, that will just work the best. So I think around 60 masking works here the best. So let's go back in 1:1, and as you can see there's a lot of noise in the picture because I've ended up with a very dark picture. I raised the shadows 100%, which is a lot. And here, actually, the first thing you want to do is not go into noise reduction, it is going to the color noise reduction, and you just want to bring that slide to the right. And what this will do is get rid of all of this purple and green sensor noise that you really can see all over the place here, and you will have in pretty much all of the dark tones if you bring up the shadows there. And it's really something that you don't even necessarily notice if you're not aware of it, but once you see the difference between before and after, you will notice how much cleaner your picture looks. It's really amazing slider. I absolutely love it. here's before and here's after. So you just want to bring that to the right until the picture looks as clean of color noise as possible, and that will just have such a big impact, especially if you're displaying your picture on a big monitor or you're going to print it. And I really think a lot of people just overjump the slider and don't even pay attention to what it does, but really one of my top sliders in Lightroom, definitely. So the next thing is noise reduction. Now noise reduction, I really have mixed feelings because I don't really like it, because it makes your whole picture look a little bit plasticky. But that said, if you have a lot of noise, and I feel like this picture right here really just kind of crossed over the border of too much noise, so I have to add a little bit of noise reduction here. But just know that if you just have a little tiny bit of noise, maybe just not messing around with the noise reduction slider might work even better, because you really take away so much of the actual sharpness and detail of your picture. But that said, this picture definitely needs a little bit of noise reduction, so I'm gonna go here to the right, just a tiny bit, maybe like 10. I really don't want to make this too much, otherwise it looks almost like a painting, and that's definitely not the look what I'm going for. So I'm just gonna add around 10 here, and that definitely looks better than before, while still remaining quite a lot of the detail. So we're done with the detail tool here. Next thing is lens corrections. This is a very simple tool and a very fast tool. You just want to go to profile, enable profile corrections, and then choose your lens, and it will get rid of all of the distortion and all of the vignetting. Now vignetting is a thing that I sometimes even bring down to 0, just because I like vignetting in my picture. I find it to often have a very positive impact because it helps to lead the viewer's eye more towards the center of the picture rather than the corners. But that said, distortion really is an amazing tool, and I haven't ever found a picture where it looks better without distortion removed. So that's definitely a thing you want to do if you want to stick with vignetting removing as well, or bring it down to 0 again. It's definitely up to you. Then the last thing here is color, and here I'm just pressing on remove color chromatic aberration, and done. This will just get rid of some of the aberration, some of the fringing on the high contrast edges that you often can see, especially on these trees. Let me remove that or turn that off real quick, and you can see all of this green fringing and just getting removed, and it makes your picture as well looking so much cleaner. Now if you have very heavy chromatic aberration, you might have to go into these sliders down here, but you know, in most pictures, probably like 95%, just pressing this button and letting Lightroom do the work for you really is just enough, and you really don't need anything more. Then effects down here, there's pretty much just one option you want to do if you want to do it, and that is adding vignetting. If you don't want to add vignetting in your picture, then just go straight away down to the camera calibration. However, I really think this picture could use a little bit of vignetting. I usually play around with the amount and midpoint slider and find a nice in-between solution, you know, what looks best, and I feel like around this amount of vignetting works pretty good. Here's before and here's after. Once again, just helps to give more attention towards the center of your picture. That's, by the way, definitely not something you have to add. That's just something that works in some of the picture, and you know, of course, is up to preference. And down here, by the way, you have grain, but really I have never once found a good use for grain in my pictures, so don't add that to your picture. It will just make it look completely terrible. So that said, we're done with the effects tools, and we're already down at the last global adjustment. So first thing you want to do here is go to profile and just play around with these different profiles. and just stick with whatever looks best. This will just change the color and the contrast and the highlight ratio of your picture. Now, depending on the picture, it might have a bigger or a smaller impact to some other pictures, but it's definitely still worth to play around, and I often change that because I just find it to work better than the Adobe Standard profile. So here's Adobe Standard. Let's go through some of the others once again. Here's camera neutral. That's definitely not working for this photo. I like this, but it's kind of a little bit too bright. This really works great. Let's see, camera standard versus Adobe Standard. Sometimes it's difficult to choose, but I feel like I like camera standard a little bit better. Yeah, so I'm just gonna stick there. And then the last thing down here are the primary color sliders, and you know, these will just change the primary colors of your picture. It's a really good idea to play around with these, especially a picture with a lot of color such as this sunset. It can have quite a big of an impact to your picture. But I'm gonna quickly, speed up the footage here, because if I would do that on screen, it will just start to lag because it's a very CPU intensive task, and additionally to that, I'm recording my screen. So really no set tactic, just play around with any slider, with all of these sliders, and just stick with whatever works best. Just the thing that is very nice to know is that, for example, if I change the blue hue here, you can see it also had an impact on the greens, so that's just something to keep in mind. But once again, just play around with everything and stick with whatever works best. So I'm quickly gonna speed that up, so see you in a second. Alright, so I'm back after messing around with these primary color sliders. Here is before profile and primary color sliders, and here's after. So you can see it definitely does have an impact to your picture, and it definitely looks better than before. So even though I'm done with the global adjustments now, I'm far from done editing this picture, because there's still local adjustments, and local adjustments can have a huge impact to your picture. So first thing I'm gonna do here is grab a graduated filter and just kind of drag it over the top portion of the sky. Make sure you have a very soft edge so everything you're gonna do looks very natural. And the reason I'm doing this is because even though we have so much variety in terms of colors here, from green to orange, reds to blues, there's still a little bit more that you can add, and I feel like the overall sky from here and upwards looks a little bit too even. So I'm just gonna add a little bit more blues, a little bit more, harsh blues here in the top part, and maybe even go to the color and add a little bit of light blue right there, and just mix that a little bit. And that way we really have even more variety in terms of color in this picture. So here's before and here's after. Just a really quick and cool thing you can do to your picture. Then I might even try and add a graduated filter just for the bottom down here, and just might even brighten that one a little bit, something like this, and I definitely think that works, and that definitely looks better than before. And a big thing that you probably notice here is that even though we've raised the shadows so much, this tree still looks a little bit dark. So I'm just gonna grab an adjustment brush here, make sure that the feather is to 100, and then I'm just gonna raise the exposure and the shadows for this adjustment brush and just paint over these leaves, over this tree right here. It doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of rough for now. and then I'm gonna raise the exposure even further, and as you can see it's way too much on the edges, but I'm just really concentrating on the middle right here, make sure that looks the best way possible, and maybe even add a little bit of tint, a little bit of magenta in this tree, maybe some of these leaves right here. Once again, it really doesn't have to be perfect for right now. And I definitely think that works. Maybe even bring down the exposure a slight bit. Then you want to press down the Alt key and also make sure that your feather is at 100, and then just kind of paint around these bright areas on the edge of your tree. Now this, depending on how fine detail you have in your tree, or you know, in your texture in your picture, you might have to go in 1:1 and really take a little bit of time and make sure that you do this very carefully. However, because I'm doing this for this video and I really don't want to bore you with like 5 minutes of detail, you know, masking with the adjustment brush, I'm just gonna do that rather quickly here, even though it might not look as great and in the end as it would look if you do this very carefully. So I still think it has a very big difference compared to where we started at. So let me just quickly make sure that looks good. And as you can see, here is before an adjustment brush and here's after, so it really just makes the whole tree come alive. And once again, if you're doing this for yourself, just be sure to take some time and go in 1:1 and just, you know, fine tune your masking of the adjustment brush. And once again, by holding down the Alt key, your adjustment brush becomes a minus, and wherever you paint over your picture while holding down the Alt key, you will get rid of the effect that you previously added with the adjustment brush. So I'm just gonna leave that there. I really think it looks okay for the very fast-paced you know, we've done here. And I'm gonna go to my last adjustment, which is the Radial Filter, which is dodge and burning, to be more specific. Dodge and burning is just making individual parts of the image darker or brighter. That way you really can add a lot of dynamic, even more dynamic, to your picture. You can do that with the adjustment brush or the Radial Filter. I just find that the Radial Filter works a little bit better for me, at least. So I'm just gonna bring up the feather to 100 here and invert the mask, and then I'm gonna start off with plus exposure. You can mix these settings with a little bit of clarity, for example, or highlights or shadows, whatever works best. Be sure to play around with these settings, especially if you're using dodge and burning for the first time. You just want to get familiar with kind of the different looks. So I'm just gonna grab an ellipse shaped Radial Filter here and just get a little bit of plus exposure. And another thing that you can do is mix these with the color right here, and I often like to bring a little bit of orange, a little bit of warmth in these filters, so it kind of looks like some of the sunlight spilled from the sky on the foreground. So I'm just gonna do that right there, and then you can just right click duplicate, drag it to another spot of your picture, right click duplicate, maybe another one here, this one a little bit smaller. Now this picture really isn't one where this will have a huge impact, but if you have a lot more foreground and a little bit less sky, it can have a huge impact. Definitely something that is worth to play around with, and it definitely can bring your picture to the next level. So I'm gonna do the same with the minus exposure here, just bring it in the middle of the other plus exposure filters, just to add a little bit of interest, a little bit more dynamic, maybe one over here and one there, and maybe even a little bit of a bigger one in the very bottom of the picture. And let me think, let me try and put one there as well. Let's just see if it works. And yeah, I actually think that does work. So maybe a last one over here. Usually I really just over jump this dodge and burning part because it's quite boring to watch, especially once you know what it's all about. But I really just wanted to give you everything in detail here. So I think I'm done with dodge and burning here. Here's before and here's after. So you can see it just adds a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more interest in the lighting. Once again, this really isn't a picture where you will see the effect of dodge and burning as much. I have some other pictures where it really has a ton of difference, way more than here. So I think I am done with the picture here. Let me quickly go into the adjustment brush that we've previously added and just kind of get rid of some of the plus exposure down here. Once again, you want to make sure that you all do this very carefully, but just wanted to end up with a really nice result while kind of keeping the video, well, not really short, but as short as possible for this kind of tutorial. So as always, let's see where we started at with the raw file. Here's the raw file. I mean, totally different image, and really amazing what you can do to a raw file. And I mean, we really have still a pretty good quality. You could definitely print this, for example. Wait until Lightroom loads. I mean, you could definitely print this 24 by 36 inches and it will still look great. Yeah, just amazing what you can get out of a raw file. And I mean, not to mention the amazing color and lighting that we've added in post-production. So I thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. That really helps me out a ton and really enables me to make these kind of videos. And if you did not like the video, please give me a thumbs down so I can improve my videos in the future. Also be sure to subscribe if you would like to see more videos just like this one in the future. So I really hope you could get some tips or techniques for your own landscape photo editing, and of course, until next episode, I want to wish you a great day and please take care.